In the early decades of the 14th century, Europe seemed, at least on the surface, to be a continent of relative stability and gradual change. It was a land still deeply rooted in the rhythms of the medieval world, a place where most people's lives were governed not by clocks or printed calendars, but by the rising and setting of the sun, by the slow turning of the seasons, and by the steady cycle of religious festivals that marked the year. From the bustling trading cities of Italy to the quiet farming villages of England, from the alpine passes of Switzerland to the wind-swept coasts of Scandinavia, life was bound together by a shared cultural and religious framework. Latin Christendom. The Catholic Church was the spiritual and moral anchor of the continent. Its network of bishops, abbots, monks, and priests reached into every village and town, providing not only religious instruction, but also the structure that shaped education, law, and social order. Cathedrals rose high above city skylines, their spires pointing toward heaven, visible for miles, physical reminders of faith and the power of God. But while the Church provided a sense of unity, Europe was far from a single political entity. The continent was a patchwork of kingdoms, principalities, duchies, free cities, and rural fiefs, each ruled by its own lords and subject to its own laws. The feudal system still dominated the countryside, where the majority of people, peasants bound to the land, lived under the authority of local nobles. These peasants worked the fields, growing grain, tending livestock, and paying rents or labor services in exchange for protection. The towns and cities, however, were beginning to grow in both population and importance. The 13th and early 14th centuries had seen a slow but steady expansion of commerce and trade. Merchant guilds and craft guilds regulated production, trade, and quality of goods. Markets and fairs were important social and economic events, drawing in people from surrounding villages. Ships from Venice, Genoa, and Pisa carried goods across the Mediterranean to and from North Africa, the Middle East, and the Byzantine Empire. Overland trade routes brought spices, silks, and other luxuries from as far as China, transported through a chain of traders across Asia. These trade networks were not merely economic arteries, they also carried ideas, technologies, and cultural influences. The revival of classical learning in the universities, advances in architecture and engineering, and the introduction of new crops and techniques from the East all flowed along the same routes that brought pepper and silk. Europe, in these years before the plague, was part of a vast, interconnected world, though most of its inhabitants could scarcely imagine the faraway lands from which these influences came. Still, life for the average person was simple and repetitive. The vast majority of the population never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace. Their homes were built of wattle and daub, with thatched roofs, 1 or 2 rooms, and no chimneys. Meals were plain, bread made from rye or barley, pottage, a thick stew of grains and vegetables, and, for those who could afford it, the occasional bit of meat or fish. In the cities, wealthier households might enjoy more variety, but even there, life was fragile. Illness, poor sanitation, and malnutrition were constant threats. Disease was not unknown in Europe before the Black Death. Local outbreaks of dysentery, smallpox, leprosy, and other ailments flared up regularly, and childhood mortality was high. But nothing in living memory prepared people for what was to come. The idea of invisible contagion, of microscopic organisms, was centuries away. Disease was explained in terms of divine punishment, bad air, or imbalances of the body's humors. Medicine was a mixture of herbal remedies, bloodletting, and prayer. The early 14th century also brought its own hardships. In 1315, a series of poor harvests began, leading to what would be remembered as the Great Famine. Cold, wet summers ruined crops across much of northern Europe, and grain prices skyrocketed. Millions were left hungry, and in some places, starvation and disease claimed entire villages. Though the famine eventually eased, the scars it left, physical, economic, and emotional, lingered in the decades that followed. Yet by the 1330s, there were signs of recovery. Markets bustled again, merchants grew wealthy, and towns expanded. In Florence, the banking families like the Bardi and the Peruzzi financed ventures across Europe. In Paris, scholars debated theology and philosophy at the university. In London, new stone buildings were rising, and in Bruges, wool merchants struck deals with traders from Italy and the Hanseatic League. The seas carried more than goods, however. Ships from the Mediterranean connected with ports in the Black Sea, which in turn were linked to caravan routes stretching deep into Asia. The Mongol Empire, which had once united much of Eurasia under a single vast rule, still maintained important trade corridors. These routes allowed for unprecedented exchange of goods and ideas, but they also provided pathways for less welcome travelers, pathogens. Far to the east, beyond the awareness of most Europeans, the seeds of catastrophe were already taking root. In the grasslands and trading towns of Central Asia, an invisible killer had begun to spread among rodents, carried in the blood of fleas. This disease, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, would soon find its way into the arteries of world trade. It would travel silently at first, hidden in the fur of rats aboard merchant ships, in the packs of traders, and in the unseen bodies of fleas. The people of Europe went about their lives unaware of the dark wave that was rolling slowly but inexorably toward them. In their fields and workshops, in their churches and taverns, they were preoccupied with the concerns of their own day: taxes, weather, harvests, wars between local lords, and the great religious questions of salvation and sin. Kings plotted against rivals, monks copied manuscripts in candlelight, and children played in the streets, their laughter echoing between timber-framed houses. If there was any forewarning, it came in rumors. Travelers sometimes brought strange stories from distant lands, of sickness sweeping through towns, of corpses left unburied, of entire villages falling silent. But such tales were often dismissed as exaggerations or the punishment of God upon faraway heathens. In a time when news travelled slowly and was often distorted in the telling, it was easy to ignore or disbelieve such accounts. The year 1346 would later be remembered as a turning point, but in the years just before it, Europe's attention was elsewhere. The 100 Years' War between England and France had begun in 1337, drawing resources and soldiers into a long and bloody conflict. In Italy, rival city-states vied for dominance. In the Baltic, the Teutonic Knights waged campaigns against pagan tribes. Life went on, as it always had, with its blend of toil, worship, festivity, and struggle. In many ways, the early 14th century was an age of contrasts, a time when magnificent cathedrals were being built even as the majority of people lived in poverty. When scholarship and art flourished in certain centres, while illiteracy remained the norm for most. It was a world balanced precariously between old traditions and new connections, a balance soon to be shattered. The Black Death would not simply be a disease. It would be a force that tore through the fabric of medieval society, altering demographics, economies, religion, and culture in ways no one could have imagined. But in these years before its arrival, the people of Europe were blissfully ignorant of the scale of the storm that was about to break. They plowed their fields, rang their church bells, bartered in marketplaces, and sang at weddings, all under the same sky that, in a few short years, would look down on empty streets and silent fields. The air was filled with the smells of hearth fires, tilled earth, and the mingling scents of animals and people in close quarters. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the chatter of women at the well, the chants of monks at prayer, all formed the soundtrack of daily life. And somewhere, far to the east, the plague crept closer. In the year 1346, the continent of Europe still held to the illusion that the world was, in its own way, ordered and comprehensible. Kings ruled by the grace of God, cities prospered through trade, and the rhythm of life, planting in spring, reaping in autumn, festivals in winter, seemed an unbroken cycle ordained since time immemorial. Yet beyond the edges of this familiar map, far away in the east, events were unfolding that would, in time, draw a dark curtain over all of Christendom. The first whispers did not arrive in the form of proclamations or heralds, but as murmurs carried by merchants and sailors. Genoese traders returning from the Black Sea brought not only silks and spices, but also stories of strange, wasting sickness in distant towns. In Constantinople, a hub of the Eastern Mediterranean, gossip flowed like wine through the markets. There was talk of villages in the steppes where entire families had perished within days. Of caravans that arrived at trading posts with half their number gone. Of a plague that blackened the skin and made the body bloat before death. Such rumours had been heard before in ages past. The East, after all, was thought to be a land of strange fevers and unknown pestilences. But this time, the accounts seemed to come with unusual urgency from multiple directions, and from witnesses who spoke with a quiet dread. At the time, these were still just words, and words were easily set aside. Europe had its own troubles. The 100 Years' War rumbled on between England and France. Famine in certain regions had not been long past. Political rivalries and papal controversies occupied the attention of rulers. For the common man or woman, sickness was an unwelcome but familiar companion. The fevers of summer, the coughs of winter, the deadly sweats that sometimes swept through towns. Illness was not extraordinary. It was part of life. The notion that something far greater, far deadlier, was approaching had not yet taken root. And yet, on the fringes of Christendom, the early signs were visible to those who looked closely. In the Crimean port city of Kafr, a Genoese colony on the Black Sea, tensions between the Italian traders and the Mongol Golden Horde had erupted into open conflict. The siege that followed in 1346 became infamous not for its military maneuvers, but for the horror that accompanied it. The besieging army, stricken by the mysterious sickness, began to die in great numbers. Chroniclers later claimed that the Mongol forces, in a desperate and terrible innovation, used catapults to hurl the corpses of their own dead over the city walls, hoping to infect the defenders within. Whether this act truly occurred or was embellished in the retelling, the result was the same. Within weeks, the disease was inside Kafr's walls, and from there it travelled aboard the ships that fled the city, ships bound for Constantinople. For Messina, for Genoa itself. The disease's journey westward was aided by the very arteries of commerce that had enriched medieval Europe. The Mediterranean Sea was alive with galleys and merchant cogs, ferrying grain, textiles, wine, oil, and countless other goods from port to port. Each vessel carried its crew, its passengers, and, unseen, unremarked, the black rats and their fleas that thrived in the holds. In these fleas, the bacterium Yersinia pestis found its perfect vehicle. But in 1346, no one knew of bacteria, nor of fleas as disease carriers. The world's understanding of contagion was shaped by miasma theory, the belief that sickness arose from foul air, rotting matter, or divine wrath. And so the ships came and went, tying Europe ever tighter to the east, drawing the sickness ever closer. By the spring of 1347, sporadic reports of strange deaths in the eastern Mediterranean reached the courts of Europe. The Venetians heard that islands in the Aegean had suffered heavy mortality. The merchants of Marseille spoke in hushed tones about alarming losses among crews arriving from Levantine ports. In Cyprus, chroniclers recorded that earthquakes shook the land and were followed by pestilence, a sign, to the medieval mind, that God was displeased and that the elements themselves were out of harmony. Still, in most of Europe, daily life went on unchanged. The great fairs continued to draw buyers and sellers. Cathedrals rang with mass. In the countryside, peasants tilled the soil. The distant nature of the threat allowed for a kind of mental comfort, an assumption that whatever was happening in those far-off places would not reach so far as to trouble the heart of Christendom. But the East told a different story. In the trading cities along the Silk Road, mortality soared. Entire caravanserais stood empty. From the steppes of Central Asia came tales of deserted villages and grass reclaiming once busy roads. Chroniclers in the Islamic world, writing from places as far apart as Persia and Syria, spoke of their plague of boils and their death that strikes in 3 days. They noted that the illness did not discriminate between rich and poor, that it struck down men and women, old and young alike. In the autumn of 1347, the barrier between rumour and reality broke. Geno's ships fleeing Kafir made landfall in Messina, Sicily. The city, a bustling port and a node in the maritime network of the Mediterranean, became one of the first places in Europe proper to feel the full force of the Black Death. The accounts from Messina were horrifying. Within days of the ship's arrival, people began to die in alarming numbers. Victims developed painful swellings, buboes, in the groin, armpit, or neck, accompanied by fever, chills, and exhaustion. In many, the disease progressed rapidly, bringing delirium, the appearance of dark blotches on the skin, and death within a matter of days. Panic gripped the city. The authorities ordered the ships to leave, but it was too late. The plague had already taken root. From Messina, it spread like fire, carried by fleeing inhabitants to Catania, to Palermo, and beyond. In each new place, the same pattern emerged: a few sudden deaths, then dozens, then hundreds, the toll rising with terrifying speed. By now, the pestilence had ceased to be a distant menace. It was a tangible, immediate threat, and the knowledge of its presence spread almost as quickly as the disease itself. The fear was not only of dying, but of dying in a way that seemed unnatural, swift, and accompanied by visible marks of divine or demonic judgment. Preachers began to speak of sin and repentance. Some communities organized processions, hoping to placate God's anger. Others turned to more desperate measures, driving out strangers, sealing city gates, or abandoning the sick altogether. Yet in many places, life still clung to its routines. Markets remained open until deaths became too numerous to ignore. Ships still arrived at harbours until the pestilence made crews too few to sail. This mix of denial, hope, and grim necessity ensured that the pathways of contagion remained open. The great trading hubs of Genoa, Venice, and Marseille were all, by the close of 1347, touched by the disease. The first shadows of the plague, then, were not a single moment but a slow, creeping advance, a tide that lapped at the edges of Europe before surging inward. To those living through it, the approach was like a darkening sky before a storm, ominous, but not yet fully comprehended. In the years to come, people would look back on this time and see all the warning signs clearly. But in the moment, they were fragments, stories, rumors, isolated events, scattered across the map, awaiting the terrible hand that would draw them together into a single, devastating narrative. In the spring of 1348, Europe's heartbeat was already unsteady. News of the terrible sickness had reached far corners of the continent, whispered in markets, murmured in churchyards, and carried along the windswept coasts by sailors whose eyes still held the memory of mass graves in other lands. But while the rumours had travelled, so too had the ships, the merchants, and the goods, and inside those goods, hidden in the straw of cargo holds or under the fur of stowaway rodents, the pestilence travelled with them. By now, the Black Death had firmly entrenched itself in the port cities along the Mediterranean. Genoa, once a bustling maritime jewel, was quieting. The harbours that had once been crowded with shouting dockworkers and the scent of salted fish now smelled faintly of sickness, of bodies not yet buried but already fading from the world. Ships still arrived, but their decks were thinly manned, and their crews often staggered onto the docks not to unload goods, but to seek a bed, any bed, where they could collapse before the fever took them. From these ports, the plague did what it always did best. It followed the lines of human movement. Trade, the lifeblood of medieval Europe, became its unwitting accomplice. Overland caravans bore precious fabrics, exotic spices, and barrels of preserved fruits inland. But along with these came fleas, small, almost invisible couriers of death, who carried in their bodies the Yersinia pestis bacterium. These fleas fed on black rats, and the rats travelled easily among grain sacks, timber shipments, and tightly packed carts. By late spring, the disease had reached inland cities like Florence, Pisa, and Avignon. In Florence, a city of art, commerce, and wealth, the streets were lined with grand stone buildings, and the sound of craftsmen's hammers rang in the air. But by mid-1348, that ringing began to fade. Merchants shut their stalls, and apprentices abandoned their workshops. Families barricaded themselves inside their homes, placing wooden beams across doors and boarding up windows, believing, mistakenly, that shutting out the air might shut out the plague. The physicians of Florence, like elsewhere, wore no strange bird-like masks yet. That image would come later, but they did carry pomanders of herbs and flowers. They believed in the miasma theory, that sickness came from bad air, a foul and invisible corruption that drifted through the streets. These doctors prescribed purges, bloodletting, and the burning of fragrant woods to cleanse the air. None of it worked. The disease was already working its way through the bloodstream of the city. North of Italy, in the rolling hills and fertile valleys of France, the story was much the same. Avignon, the seat of the papacy at that time, was a city swollen with clergy, merchants, and pilgrims. The arrival of the plague here caused not only a public health crisis but a spiritual one. How could such a catastrophe befall the very home of God's representative on earth? The Pope himself, Clement VI, retreated into a chamber where great fires were kept burning day and night in the belief that heat would purify the air. He survived, perhaps because the isolation kept him away from infected fleas, but thousands in Avignon did not. The Rhone River became a silent conveyor belt for the dead. Corpses wrapped in cloth were set adrift, carried away from the city to prevent overcrowding of the cemeteries. The water, once a source of life and commerce, now bore grim cargo downstream. As the months passed, the plague began to seep beyond the great urban centres into the smaller towns and villages. Here, the effects were even more devastating. In a small farming village, a few deaths could mean the loss of those who tilled the fields or tended the livestock. In many such places, entire harvests rotted where they stood, for there were no hands left to bring them in. The link between urban and rural life began to fray. Cities depended on the countryside for food, and the countryside depended on cities for goods and markets. Now, both bled life into the same dark grave. By the time the summer heat came in 1348, the pestilence had claimed tens of thousands, but it showed no sign of slowing. The pattern was chillingly predictable: a few unexplained deaths, followed by a sudden flood of sickness. Fever, chills, and the swelling of lymph nodes into great, painful buboes in the neck, armpits, and groin. Some victims survived a few days, others died within hours. The skin of many darkened, giving the disease its grim name, the Black Death. Burial became one of the most urgent problems in every afflicted community. At first, priests performed the last rites over each body, and families buried their dead in consecrated ground. But as death multiplied, this became impossible. Graves were dug in haste, often without ceremony. In some places, deep pits were opened outside the city walls, into which bodies were laid in layers, covered with quicklime, and then more bodies laid atop them. The smell of these pits was carried on the wind for miles. The plague did not spare any class or rank. Nobles died alongside peasants. In London, which would not see the full fury until later, stories already reached from abroad of kings' courts struck down, of wealthy merchants lying in the same mass graves as beggars. Death was the great equalizer, and in 1348, it was everywhere. By the autumn of that year, it was clear to all that this was no ordinary sickness. This was something biblical in scale. Many began to believe it was a punishment from God for the sins of humankind. Flagellant movements arose, groups of men who travelled from town to town, whipping themselves in public displays of penance, believing their suffering might earn God's mercy. Crowds gathered to watch these grim processions, some joining in, others watching silently as the sound of lashes on bare backs mixed with prayers for deliverance. But even these acts could not halt the disease. If anything, the gatherings may have helped spread it further, as infected fleas passed from one host to another. By the close of 1348, the map of Europe was darkening with plague's reach. From the shores of the Mediterranean to the towns along the Rhine, from the bustling streets of Paris to the countryside of Aragon, death was no longer a rumour, it was a daily presence. Bells tolled almost constantly, marking not the hour, but another soul's passing. Yet the worst was still to come. Winter would bring a brief slowing, as fleas and rats were less active in the cold, but come spring, the plague would resume its relentless march northward, toward England, the Low Countries, and beyond. For now, Europe existed in a strange, fearful limbo, exhausted by grief, yet bracing for the next wave. It was in the early months of 1348 that the air in Europe began to feel heavier, though no one could truly explain why. The winter had been damp and strangely warm, the kind that kept the ground wet and the streets slick with mud, a season where the frost never fully took hold. To the farmers in the countryside, it meant confusion for their crops, for seeds did not rest in proper dormancy. To merchants in the cities, it meant roads that remained open but sodden, carts sinking into ruts carved deep by iron-rimmed wheels. Yet to the common people, those who did not track the markets or measure the harvest by coin, it was nothing more than an odd turn in the weather. The wind still blew. The church bells still rang. Life, for now, seemed unchanged. But there was something else, a creeping unease that could not be touched, only felt. Rumours, faint at first, travelled slowly along the same trade routes that carried spices from the east and wool from the English hills. Whispers came from the ports, from sailors with eyes set deep into hollow sockets. They spoke of sickness in distant lands, of bodies burned in great pyres, of cities emptied of their inhabitants. These tales were often dismissed as exaggerations, for seamen were known to spin grand stories in the taverns. Yet there was a weight in their words that lingered, like a taste of iron at the back of the tongue. In London, Paris, and Florence, life pressed on with its usual rhythms. Merchants opened their shutters each morning, calling out to passers-by in the marketplace. Fishmongers laid out their catch on damp wooden tables, scales glittering in the pale light. Bakers pulled steaming loaves from their ovens, the scent of warm bread drifting into the narrow lanes. Women in linen caps bargained for vegetables, children darted between the legs of strangers, and friars passed through the crowd with quiet blessings. The church stood as it always had, tall and steady against the sky, its bells calling the faithful to prayer. Yet beneath this outward normality, there was a subtle change, a tightening of conversation, a glance over the shoulder, a silence when strangers approached. People began to watch travellers more closely, especially those from the ports, where goods and people arrived from lands farther than most could imagine. Ships brought silks, spices, and exotic wares, but now they also brought a faint scent of dread. To understand how this dread would take root, one must understand the world as it was in that moment, its fragility, its dependence on threads stretched thin across continents. Europe was not a closed land. It was a great web, each city and village tied to another through trade, pilgrimage, and war. In the east, the Mongol Empire's vast roads had connected markets from the shores of the Mediterranean to the cities of China. Goods moved swiftly, but so too did news, ideas, and disease. What had once been a marvel of connection was about to become a conduit for catastrophe. The sickness, though Europe did not yet know it, was already on its way. It had begun years before in the plains of Central Asia, a place of wide skies and restless winds. There, in burrows beneath the earth, small creatures harbored the seeds of death, black rats, their fur coarse and oily, carrying fleas in whose tiny bodies the invisible enemy bred and multiplied. From one host to another, it leapt unseen, riding the caravans of merchants, the wagons of soldiers, and the holds of ships. In the bustling ports of the Black Sea, it found its perfect crossroads, where Italian merchants traded with Byzantine dealers and Muslim sailors alike. By the time winter eased into spring in 1348, the disease had already swept through the Crimea, through Constantinople, and into the warm harbours of the Mediterranean. But still, inland, no one knew the scope of what was coming. The markets were full, the fields green, the taverns noisy. It was, in the cruelest sense, the quiet before the storm. In the Tuscan hills, Florence thrived as a jewel of trade and art. The city's wool merchants sent their fine cloth across Europe, while goldsmiths shaped delicate works for the wealthy. In the shadows of the cathedral's rising dome, apprentices mixed pigments and ground marble dust for plaster. Streets bustled with bankers and scholars, peasants and priests. The air was filled with the mingled scents of roasting meats, horses, and incense drifting from church doors. Yet, in a small corner of the city near the Arno River, a ship unloaded its cargo. Among the crates and barrels, unseen by any dockworker, rats scurried ashore. Their fleas, swollen with blood, leapt to new hosts. A cycle had begun, silent, invisible, and unstoppable. Far to the north, in the ports of England, ships from France and Flanders docked daily. The narrow streets of London swarmed with traders, craftsmen, and travellers. The city's wooden houses leaned toward each other over the cobbled lanes, their upper floors nearly touching. Waste was thrown into the gutters, where rain washed it toward the Thames, whose waters served both as a lifeline and a foul, sluggish drain. It was a city full of life, and one that would soon be full of death. The first to fall ill were often those closest to the docks. They felt it as a sudden fever, a weakness in the limbs, a swelling in the groin or under the arms. Within a day, the swelling turned black and oozed, the fever burned hotter, and the victim's skin mottled with dark spots. Death came quickly, sometimes in less than 3 days. But in these earliest cases, no one understood the pattern. Illness was part of life. People fell sick and recovered, or they did not. The connection between these deaths, spread across different cities, was invisible to the minds of the time. Priests preached that sickness came as punishment for sin. Physicians, trained in the ancient works of Galen, spoke of imbalances in the humours, too much black bile, too much phlegm, and prescribed bleeding, purging, and the use of herbs. Wealthy families burned sweet-smelling woods in their hearts to cleanse the air. The poor did what they could, prayers, charms, and the carrying of poses to ward off the stench they believed carried illness. Yet, as spring deepened into summer, the pace of death quickened. In the narrow lanes of Marseille, bodies began to pile in the courtyards of churches. In Florence, entire households fell silent, their doors marked with crude symbols to warn others away. In London, the ringing of church bells became constant, until it was no longer possible to toll them for every soul lost. And still, the roads and seas carried more travellers. Merchants moved from city to city, soldiers marched to new fronts, pilgrims made their way to holy sites. Along with their wares, their armour, and their devotions, they carried the plague. It clung to them invisibly, waiting in the bite of a flea, in the touch of a hand, in the breath of a cough. By midsummer of 1348, Europe was no longer merely hearing rumours of a distant sickness. It was living in its shadow. The great web of trade and travel that had bound its people together now bound them to a shared fate. No town, no village, no monastery could consider itself truly safe. The road ahead would be long and dark, and it had only just begun. The wind that rolled across the hills that morning carried with it a strange heaviness, the kind of weight that made people pause in their chores without knowing exactly why. The air was neither particularly cold nor unusually warm, but it had that still, dense quality that makes the world feel muffled, as though nature itself had drawn a heavy curtain over the land. Thomas noticed it first when he stepped out of his small cottage to fetch water from the well. He stopped halfway down the worn dirt path, his wooden bucket dangling at his side, and simply stood there, squinting at the horizon where the grey mist seemed to cling longer than it should. It wasn't fog, not exactly. It was more like a pale, lingering smoke, though no fire had been seen in the village for days. Behind him, inside their cottage, Eleanor was already awake, carefully ladling out the last of their oats into the small iron pot. The thin porridge would be their breakfast, and perhaps their supper as well. The stores in the village had grown scarce, and what little the traders brought was sold at prices no ordinary family could afford. She glanced toward the doorway, wondering why Thomas hadn't returned with the water yet, but she said nothing. These days, silence was common. Words seemed to cost energy they couldn't spare. Thomas finally forced himself to move forward, his boots crunching lightly over the frosted grass. The well sat in the centre of the village green, surrounded by 4 cottages, a crooked wooden cart, and the remnants of a market stall that no one had bothered to pack away after its owner fell ill. The rope of the well creaked faintly as he lowered the bucket, listening to the splash far below. The sound should have been reassuring, proof that the water still flowed, but instead it made his stomach twist. He couldn't help thinking of the whispers, rumors that even the water might not be safe anymore, that sickness could crawl invisibly through every drop. As he drew the bucket up, Thomas saw old Margaret shuffling toward him. Her bent figure was wrapped in a patchwork shawl, and her pale, watery eyes peered out beneath a hood. She had been one of the loudest voices when the plague first arrived in the nearby towns, warning everyone to keep to themselves, to burn any belongings of the dead, to keep away from outsiders. But now, she looked less like a voice of warning and more like a shadow drifting through the village, her steps slow, her breaths shallow. "You've heard, haven't you?" she rasped, stopping a few feet away. Thomas shook his head. "Heard what?" Margaret glanced around, as though making sure no one else was listening, though the street was empty. "The miller's youngest. Gone in the night." Thomas's grip on the bucket tightened. He knew the boy, Jacob, no more than 8 years old, with a face always smudged from flour and a larf that could carry across the fields. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came. There was nothing to say anymore when someone died. The same sentences had been spoken too many times, and they had lost their shape. Margaret didn't linger for his response. She shuffled past him, heading toward the well as though every step was an act of stubborn defiance against her own frailty. Thomas turned back toward home, the bucket's weight pulling at his arm. His thoughts felt heavy too, like the mist in the air had seeped into his head. He tried not to imagine the miller's cottage now, quiet, with its door shut tight, the smell of sickness still clinging inside. He tried not to imagine Eleanor's face when he told her. But he knew he wouldn't have to tell her. In a village this small, news travelled on the wind. Inside, Eleanor was stirring the thin porridge slowly, though it no longer needed stirring. She looked up when he entered, her eyes meeting his for just a moment. She could read the news there without him speaking. She lowered her gaze again, pressing her lips together. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, only inevitable. They ate without much appetite. Outside, the muffled world continued, distant coughing from somewhere across the green, the groan of a door hinge, the sudden caw of a crow. Every sound seemed sharper now, standing out against the quiet like ink on parchment. By midday, the grey mist had not lifted. It pressed low over the thatched rooftops, casting everything in a dim, colourless light. Thomas busied himself with chopping firewood behind the cottage, though his body felt sluggish. Each swing of the axe seemed heavier than the last, and sweat beaded along his brow despite the chill. Eleanor, meanwhile, tried to mend a tear in one of his shirts, but her hands trembled too much to guide the needle properly. She pricked her finger and stared for a moment at the small bead of blood before wiping it away on her apron. It was late in the afternoon when the church bell rang. One slow, deep toll, followed by another, and then another. 3 times in total. Everyone in the village knew what that meant. Another burial. Thomas set the axe aside and wiped his palms on his trousers, while Eleanor rose slowly from her seat, her sewing forgotten. Neither of them spoke, but they both stepped outside. The burial ground lay on the far edge of the village, a patch of uneven earth bordered by a crumbling stone wall. By the time they arrived, a small group had already gathered, no more than 10 people. Most stood at a distance, their hoods drawn, scarves covering their mouths. At the center, 2 men lowered a shrouded form into the open grave. The miller stood nearby, his shoulders hunched, his face pale and drawn. His wife was absent, too unwell to come. The priest spoke the familiar words, though his voice was hoarse and thin. The earth thudded softly over the body, and a crow, black as ink, landed on the stone wall to watch. No one shooed it away. When it was over, people drifted back toward their homes without conversation. Thomas lingered a moment longer, his gaze fixed on the fresh mound of soil. He felt Eleanor's hand brush lightly against his, a small gesture of comfort, though neither of them could say for whom it was meant. That night, the wind picked up. The thatch above their heads rustled, and the old wooden shutters rattled softly. Thomas lay awake long after Eleanor's breathing had settled into the slow rhythm of sleep. The day's images played over and over in his mind: the miller's hollow face, the boy's absence, the mist that refused to lift. And beneath it all was the creeping fear, growing stronger each day, that their turn would come soon enough. The morning that broke over the city was unlike any other in living memory. A pale and almost sickly light poured over the rooftops, the sun muted by a thin veil of greyish mist that hung low in the air. It was not the mist of rain or sea, but something else, something that carried the faint stench of rot and damp earth, as though the very air had grown ill. The streets below were quiet, almost too quiet, save for the occasional distant creak of a shutter swinging loosely on rusted hinges or the muffled sound of a crow's wing cutting the air. What was once the bustling heart of the town now resembled an abandoned dream. The market square, where vendors used to cry out the price of their goods and argue loudly with customers, was now littered with toppled baskets, rotting vegetables, and scraps of fabric fluttering weakly in the breeze. Wooden stalls leaned crookedly as though weary from holding themselves upright, their awnings torn and weather-beaten. Somewhere in the shadows of an alley, a black cat slinked silently past, its eyes glinting in the dim light, watching everything but trusted by no one. For Thomas and Eleanor, stepping into this world felt like walking into the memory of a place rather than the place itself. They had been away for nearly 3 weeks, forced into hiding when the sickness had swept through their quarter with such vicious speed that staying would have meant certain death. They had sought refuge in the crumbling barn of a farm long abandoned on the outskirts, surviving on stale bread, rainwater, and what little they could forage from the land. But now, driven by hunger and the desperate need for supplies, they had returned. The moment they stepped through the half-collapsed city gate, the difference was like a blow to the chest. Before, there had been noise. Even in the early days of the plague, there was still shouting, crying, and the sounds of cartwheels rattling over cobblestones as the dead were carried away. Now, silence had claimed the city like an emperor seizing his prize. Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, glancing nervously at the darkened windows of the houses they passed. "They're watching," she whispered, though she could not say who they were. There was no movement, no face behind the shutters, yet the weight of unseen eyes seemed to press down upon them. Thomas carried the small axe they had found in the barn, not as a weapon meant for people, but for prying open doors and crates. Still, his grip on the worn wooden handle tightened every time a shadow moved in the corner of his vision. "We'll be quick," he muttered, his voice low. "Get food. Get water. And then leave." They turned down a side street where the cobblestones were cracked and uneven, weeds pushing up between the gaps. A toppled cart blocked part of the way, its wheels splintered and its contents, mostly sacks of grain, spilled out and soaked from the rain. Rats had long since claimed it, their small bodies darting in and out of the burlap sacks. Eleanor flinched as one skittered across her path. The air here was heavier, thicker, as if carrying the memory of the countless last breaths exhaled in this place. The smell of death was faint but lingering, old enough to no longer burn the nostrils, but stubborn enough to cling to the soul. They reached the old baker's shop first. The sign, a wooden carving of a loaf of bread, hung crookedly on its last nail, creaking with each gust of wind. Thomas pushed the door gently, half expecting it to be locked. It wasn't. It swung inward with a groan, revealing a room coated in dust and shadow. The shelves were bare save for a single clay jar in the corner. Thomas reached for it, uncorking it with a faint pop. Inside was a hardened lump of honey, crystallized with age. "Better than nothing," he said, tucking it into the sack slung over his shoulder. Eleanor, meanwhile, moved toward the counter. There was a child's shoe lying there, tiny and scuffed, with the leather peeling at the edges. She picked it up without thinking, turning it over in her hands. The weight of it made her chest tighten. Whoever had worn it had either grown out of it, or never had the chance to. She set it back down gently, as though afraid to disturb something sacred. From the street outside came the sound of something falling, a wooden clatter, sharp and sudden. Both froze, eyes darting toward the door. Thomas moved silently toward it, peering out. Nothing. The street lay still. But the stillness was not empty. Far down the road, near the edge where the houses met the square, a lone figure stood. Draped in a long black cloak with a hood pulled low, the person was motionless, as if carved from stone. Thomas couldn't see their face, only the suggestion of pale skin in the shadow of the hood. When he blinked, they were gone. He closed the door slowly, his jaw tight. "We need to move." They left the baker's and headed further into the city, keeping to the narrow alleys where the wind didn't bite so sharply. Each step took them deeper into the hollowed heart of the place. They passed the tanner's shop, its vats of dye now a thick, unmoving sludge. The butcher's, where hooks hung empty and rusted. A church whose door was barred from the inside, the faint echo of a hymn still seeming to cling to its stones. The farther they went, the more they felt it, that sensation of being followed. Sometimes it was the faint scuff of a shoe on stone. Sometimes the whisper of fabric brushing a wall. Every time they turned to look, the street was bare. By midday, the clouds had thickened, smothering what little sunlight had filtered through. The air grew colder. Eleanor shivered, rubbing her hands together. "We should go back." "Not yet," Thomas said, though his voice carried less conviction now. They had found little so far, enough to fill barely half the sack. Leaving now would mean risking another trip soon. They reached the edge of the old marketplace and stopped. This was the place that had once been the beating heart of the city, where goods from distant lands were traded and news from across the seas was shouted aloud. Now it lay in ruins. Stalls lay overturned, their wares scattered and left to rot. A single gallows stood in the center, the rope swaying gently in the wind like a pendulum keeping time in a dead man's hour. Eleanor's gaze was drawn to the steps of the gallows. Something lay there, curled and unmoving. It was a man, or what remained of one, dressed in tattered clothing, his face hidden in the crook of his arm. She took a step forward before Thomas caught her wrist. "Don't," he said sharply. She looked at him, startled. "There's no reason to go closer," he murmured. "Whatever you want to know about him, you already know." They turned to leave when a voice cut through the silence. "You shouldn't be here." It came from behind them, quiet but steady. They turned slowly. The hooded figure from earlier stood at the far end of the square. When the last winter of the plague years began to loosen its icy grip upon the land, a strange, unsteady quiet fell over the villages and towns of Europe. It was not the quiet of peace, nor the tranquility of a gentle countryside. It was the hollow stillness of absence. Streets that once bustled with carts, hawkers, and the clamour of horses' hooves now lay open to the wind. Shops remained shuttered, their doors warped by rain and neglect. Roof tiles had fallen and no one had bothered to replace them. There was no rush to repair, for there were too few left to buy, to sell, or to care. For those who had survived, life felt like walking through a half-forgotten dream, familiar in shape, yet wrong in every detail. The air smelled of damp wood and old ashes rather than bread from the baker's oven or the tang of freshly slaughtered meat from the market. In many places, grass had begun to creep into the cobbled roads, poking defiantly between the stones as though reclaiming the ground from the hand of man. Among these surviving souls was Anselm, a middle-aged scribe who had once worked in the service of the local abbey. Before the plague, his hands had been constantly busy, copying charters, drafting letters, recording transactions for the monks. But now the abbey's brethren had been reduced to barely half their number, and the work had slowed to a trickle. Anselm spent most of his days wandering through the hushed lanes of his town, the sound of his own boots the only rhythm to accompany him. He had become something of a reluctant observer to the aftermath. Every time he passed the square, he saw the remains of the great pyres where bodies had been burned in desperation during the height of the sickness. The blackened patches were still visible on the ground, faintly marked like shadows that would never truly fade. The survivors were a scattered people, wary of one another even now. The memory of the plague lingered like a ghost. A cough or a fever could still send hearts racing with dread. Friendships had frayed under suspicion. Who had brought the sickness? Who had hidden symptoms? Who had abandoned their neighbours in fear? But if the plague had hollowed out the population, it had also loosened the strict bonds of the old order. There were whispers that in some villages, peasants had taken up land abandoned by their lords, tilling it for themselves. In others, merchants who had once bowed to guild rules now traded freely, for there was no one left to enforce the old restrictions. Priests, in their dwindled numbers, found themselves serving far larger flocks, and some preached messages that would have been unthinkable a few years earlier. Sermons about God's judgment, yes, but also about God's mercy on the humble and the poor. It was in this shifting, uncertain world that Isolde, a young woman of about 20, tried to make her way. She had lost her entire family to the plague within the span of a single month, and for weeks afterward had lived on the edge of starvation. But she had learned quickly. She gathered herbs from the fields, traded them for bread, and bartered her skill at sewing to keep herself in warm clothing. Her needle and thread were often the only colour in her otherwise grey days. Isolde had come to know Anselm by chance. One wet spring afternoon, she had been sheltering beneath the overhang of the abbey's cloister when he passed by. They had exchanged a few words about the rain, and in the way of lonely people, they had kept talking. Over the months, a cautious friendship had formed, bound together by shared loss and the quiet understanding of those who had seen too much death to waste words. Together, they began to take stock of their world. Anselm, with his knowledge of records, tried to map out who still lived in the nearby hamlets. Isolde, with her practical skill, worked to mend what could be salvaged: clothing, baskets, even torn blankets abandoned in the plague houses. One afternoon, the two of them walked the road toward a village called Hallowford, where Anselm had heard that a small market was beginning to stir again. The path took them through open fields, many lying fallow. Here and there, they passed cottages with doors swinging open, the wind sighing through them. It was hard not to imagine the lives once lived there, a pot simmering on a fire, the sound of a child laughing outside, now replaced only by the murmur of crows. When they reached Hallowford, they found a strange sight. In the centre of the square, a handful of stalls had indeed been set up, but they were manned by strangers. Traders had come from far-off places, men with darker skin and unfamiliar accents, bringing bolts of cloth and jars of preserved fruit. The plague, it seemed, had broken not only the bonds of local life but also the old barriers to trade. With so many gone, new people had stepped in to fill the gaps. Isolde walked among the stalls with cautious curiosity. She fingered a length of blue fabric, richer in hue than anything she had seen in months. "It comes from Genoa," the merchant told her. She did not know where Genoa was, but the name sounded like something from a storybook. As the days turned to weeks, Anselm and Isolde returned to Hallowford often. They began to see how the town was reshaping itself, widows taking up the trades of their dead husbands, children helping to run stalls, and landless men working in exchange for food instead of coin. The rules were changing, not all at once, but in ways that were becoming impossible to ignore. The abbey's prior, Father Matthew, was wary of these changes. He feared that the loosening of the old order would lead to sin and chaos. But Anselm quietly disagreed. To him, the plague had already shown the fragility of human pretensions. Perhaps it was time for a new way of living. Still, the shadow of the Black Death was never far. Rumours drifted in of fresh outbreaks in distant towns, and every traveller was met with wary eyes. Isolde herself sometimes woke in the night, heart pounding, convinced she felt the first ache of fever. The chapter of recovery was long and uneven, and the wounds of the plague years would take decades to fade. But in the fragile shoots of trade in Hallowford, in the unlikely friendship of a scribe and a sempstress, there was a hint, just a hint, that life could take root again, even in soil steeped in death. The winter of 1350 settled over England like a suffocating blanket of frost, but it was not only the cold that gripped the land. For years now, whispers of pestilence had become the common refrain of every household, from the stone halls of nobles to the lowliest thatched cottages of peasants. The plague, this mysterious, cruel, and relentless sickness, had swept through with a vengeance, taking the lives of rich and poor alike. And yet, the land had not found peace. Even as the death toll slowed in some places, in others it surged anew, like waves crashing relentlessly upon a shore. Within the crumbling walls of the small manor house on the outskirts of York, the air was thick not only with the acrid scent of burning peat, but also with tension. Lady Eleanor sat by the dim light of a single beeswax candle, her fingers wrapped tightly around a strip of linen she was attempting to stitch into something resembling a scarf. The needle pricked her thumb, drawing a bead of blood, but she scarcely noticed. Her mind was elsewhere, on the news that had arrived earlier that day from a messenger who had ridden hard from the south. The sickness was spreading again. She had hoped, no, prayed, that their small estate, tucked away amidst snow-covered fields and leafless trees, might be spared this time. The last wave had claimed more than half the villagers, and the survivors still bore the hollow-eyed look of those who had seen too much. Among the dead had been children she had watched grow from swaddling clothes to sturdy youth, and even old Thomas, the gardener, whose gnarled hands had tended these grounds for longer than Eleanor had been alive. In the corner of the room, Thomas's grandson, Matthew, sat sharpening a rust-speckled knife. He was only 17, but the events of the last few years had stripped away whatever softness his youth might have afforded him. His father had died in the first outbreak, his mother in the second. Now, he worked in the manor, a silent presence who carried out his duties with grim determination. The door creaked open, and the cold night air swept in along with a tall figure swathed in a heavy cloak. Sir William, Eleanor's husband, stepped inside, stamping the snow from his boots. His face, usually so composed, was drawn with worry. He removed his gloves slowly, as though delaying the words he must speak. "It's worse than we thought," he said at last, his voice low. "The pestilence has reached York again. Entire households are falling ill overnight. The market square is nearly deserted." Eleanor set down her needlework, her heart pounding. "And here?" "Not yet," William replied, but the hesitation in his voice betrayed his doubt. "But it will not be long. The roads bring more than just trade. Fear travels faster than goods." For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the pop and hiss of the fire. Then Eleanor spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "We must prepare." Over the following days, preparations began in earnest. The villagers were instructed to avoid unnecessary gatherings. The manor's gates, which normally stood open, were closed, and guards were posted. Food stores were inventoried, and William ordered the construction of a crude barrier along the road leading to the village, hoping to slow the arrival of strangers. Matthew worked tirelessly, carrying sacks of grain from the barn, chopping wood until his hands blistered, and helping to repair the palisade. Eleanor watched him sometimes from the window, feeling an ache in her chest. He was so young, and yet life had demanded from him the resilience of a man twice his age. But no amount of preparation could stop what was coming. It began with a single cough. Old Margaret, the washerwoman who had survived the last outbreak, fell ill one bitter morning. At first, it seemed a simple chill. But within 2 days, her skin was mottled with dark blotches, her breathing laboured, and she could barely lift her head from her straw mattress. The stench of sickness seeped from her cottage, carried on the frigid wind. By the week's end, there were 5 more cases. The plague was here. The manor became both sanctuary and prison. William forbade anyone from leaving unless absolutely necessary, and those who did ventured out with cloths soaked in vinegar pressed to their faces. Eleanor oversaw the sick room, though every instinct told her to stay away from the infected. She could not bear to see the suffering and do nothing. She washed the faces of the fevered, whispered prayers over the dying, and comforted weeping children whose parents were too weak to speak. One evening, as she sat beside Margaret's bed, the old woman stirred. Her voice was barely audible, a dry rasp. "It's the end, my lady. God's wrath upon us all." Eleanor swallowed the lump in her throat. "Rest, Margaret. You must rest." But the words rang hollow. The truth was inescapable. They were living under a shadow that no wall, no gate, no prayer could fully keep at bay. As the days turned into weeks, the village seemed to shrink. The sound of laughter vanished, replaced by the tolling of the church bell, its mournful note carrying across the snow. Father Anselm, the parish priest, moved like a ghost from one house to another, administering last rites, his own eyes sunken from exhaustion. One night, Eleanor found William standing alone in the great hall, staring into the flames. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of responsibilities and fears that could crush any man. She went to him, placing a hand on his arm. "We'll see it through," she said, though she did not know if she believed it. William looked at her then, his eyes glinting with the reflection of the fire. "If we survive this," he murmured, "we will not be the same. None of us will." By midwinter, the plague had claimed more than half the village once again. Entire families were buried in shallow graves dug in frozen earth. Matthew's cough worried Eleanor, though he insisted it was nothing more than the cold. She prayed he was right. She prayed for all of them. But prayers, it seemed, were lost in the endless winter wind. The winter of 1351 settled over Europe like a suffocating shroud. Snow came earlier than expected, dusting the roofs of abandoned villages where no one remained to shovel the drifts from their doorways. In the towns that had survived the worst of the plague, the streets were quieter than they had been in living memory. The bells of the churches, which had once rung so frequently for Mass, for weddings, and for baptisms, now tolled only for the dead, and even then, they were rung by hands weary from digging more graves than any heart could bear. Matthias, the once hopeful apprentice who had seen his master die in the first wave of the sickness, walked alone along the muddy track into Ghent. His boots were caked with frozen slush, and his breath curled in the air before him like pale ghosts. Behind him, the land was barren, fields untended, farmhouses collapsed under the weight of months of neglect. He had not spoken to another living soul in 3 days. When he reached the outskirts of the city, he found the gates ajar. They hung crooked on their hinges, one splintered as if struck by a cart in haste. Inside, there were signs of life, but only in scattered, flickering hints. A cart creaked past, pulled by a gaunt mule, its driver bundled in a patched cloak. The smell of burning would mingled with another, more acrid odour, the familiar, dreadful scent of sickness. Matthias had come to Ghent for one reason. He had heard whispers in the last village he passed through that a cure was being attempted here. Not a miracle, nor a true salvation. No one believed in such things anymore, but some mixture of herbs, vinegar, and smoke that might offer a measure of protection. The thought was desperate, but in the years since the first bodies had fallen, desperation was all anyone had left. He made his way to the marketplace, which no longer sold meat or grain in abundance, but instead hosted strange gatherings of healers, herbalists, and charlatans. There were women selling amulets etched with prayers, men offering powders of ground pearls or crushed emeralds, and even a few who claimed to possess relics of saints that could ward off pestilence. Each shouted their wares into the cold, their voices hoarse. One woman caught Matthias's attention. She was old, her back bent, but her eyes shone with fierce intelligence. In front of her stall burned a small brazier, sending up fragrant plumes of rosemary and juniper. "Keep the air clean," she said to those who passed, "ere the pestilence cannot find you." Matthias stepped closer. "Does it work?" he asked. Her gaze lingered on him for a moment before she replied, "It works better than hope alone. But nothing works forever." She handed him a small pouch of dried leaves. "Boil them. Breathe the steam. Sleep with this near your bed. And if the sickness comes," she stopped herself, the rest unspoken. He paid her with the last silver coin in his pouch. As he tucked the herbs into his satchel, he looked around the market square again. What he saw made his stomach twist, not the cellars, not the brazier smoke, but the absence. The fountain at the centre, once a meeting place for gossip and trade, was dry. The bakery that had filled the air with the scent of bread was shuttered. And the tavern door swung in the wind, though no laughter or song spilled from within. That night, Matthias found a place to sleep in the loft of an abandoned stable. Through the cracks in the roof, he could see the stars, so bright and cold they looked as though they might shatter. Somewhere in the city, a lone dog howled. The days passed in a rhythm of searching and waiting. He joined a small group of survivors who shared what they could. Among them was Elise, a weaver whose family had died in the second year of the plague, and Brother Anselm, a monk with deep-set eyes who no longer spoke of God with certainty, but who still carried a wooden cross at his belt. Together, they tended to the sick when they could, buried the dead when they must, and waited for a future that seemed as far away as summer. Winter deepened, and with it, the sickness seemed to shift. The great waves of death had passed, but smaller outbreaks flared in sudden bursts, like embers from a dying fire. No one trusted that the worst was truly over. They kept their doors barred at night, their food covered, their water boiled. Yet still, sometimes, a cough would come, and within days, another grave would be dug. One morning, Elise came to Matthias with news. "There's word from the south," Ishi said. "A ship has come from Italy. They say life is beginning again there, that markets are open, and children play in the streets." Matthias wanted to believe her, but he had heard too many rumors in the past years, each one crushed by reality. Still, the thought took root in him. He imagined green fields, orchards heavy with fruit, the murmur of a crowd gathered for something other than a funeral. Spring came slowly. Snow melted into grey slush, which turned the streets to mud. The first flowers, shy and pale, pushed their way through the thawing earth. The air no longer carried the constant scent of death. People emerged more often into the open, their faces still wary but no longer entirely hopeless. It was Brother Anselm who finally said what they were all thinking. "Perhaps it is time to go," he told Matthias and Elise. "If the world beyond is stirring, we cannot stay here and fade like the memory of what was." They left Ghent together, travelling south along roads that had been empty for years. The journey was long, and they passed through places that would never recover, villages reclaimed by weeds, churches whose roofs had collapsed. Yet in other places, they saw signs of life returning. A farmer ploughing his field. Children chasing one another along a stream. Women hanging laundry that rippled in the wind. By the time they reached the coast, the sea air was warm. The harbour was not as busy as it had been in the days before the plague, but it was alive. Ships creaked at their moorings, gulls wheeled overhead, and merchants haggled over bolts of cloth and barrels of wine. Matthias stood at the edge of the dock, looking out over the glittering water. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that there might be a place in the world where laughter could return, where hands could build instead of bury. And though the memory of the Black Death would never leave them, though the scars it had carved into their lives would remain, they stepped forward together, into a future they could not yet see but were willing, at last, to seek.